That is Ontario Premier Doug Ford digging into Sean Fraser after the federal justice minister announced his intention last week to ask the Supreme Court to limit how Section 33 of the Canadian Constitution is used. Better known as the notwithstanding clause. It's a sort of get-out-of-charter-free card that allows governments to pass laws that contravene certain rights and freedoms guaranteed in the charter. Fraser sent his request as Canada's top court hears a landmark case on Quebec's secularism law, known as Bill 21, which that province's government used the notwithstanding clause to pass. Fraser writing in part about his decision, this case is about more than the immediate issues before the court. The Supreme Court's decision will shape how both federal and provincial governments may use the notwithstanding clause for years to come. Let's bring back the front bench to get into this one. Christy Clark, Marco Mendicino, James Moore, and Monty Solberg. This morning I was thinking I had wanted to talk about it with this panel. Last week it didn't work out. This week, and I was thinking, oh gosh, is there anything that's going to come that's going to be new and relevant? And like
Jimmy
usual,
Kimmel's
Doug Ford
on.
steps up to the microphone.
Jimmy Kimmel's back on.
Doug Ford steps up to the microphone and gives me a reason. Christy, I have to start with you as the former premier of the group here. Is this, the accusation from certain corners has been that the federal government's ask of the Supreme Court amounts to overreach. Do you think it is?
Well, yes, the only person on this panel who has ever contemplated actually using the notwithstanding clause in government, I can say, I think it's really important that we preserve it. And I will say, Doug Ford is right, which is the notwithstanding clause was included in the Constitution in order to get premiers to agree with the passing of the new law, because they understood that what it would do is it would give the Supreme Court of Canada, which is appointed by the federal government, which is a partisan institution, the federal government, at least in its majority, it would give them the right to be able to make laws that Canadians who are going to be expected to abide by those laws have no say over, because you can't elect judges if you don't like what they said. And Doug Ford is absolutely spot on right about that. I'm going to add a little color to this, though. I do think that the reason the federal government has decided to get on this issue is not just because of Quebec. I think part of it is because Danielle Smith is bringing forward legislation on trans rights. They want to find a way into that issue, be able to talk about that issue, seem like they are on the right side of that issue without getting all tangled up in all the identity politics that Justin Trudeau got tangled up in. And I think, it's absolutely the wrong direction for them to take. They should be focusing on economic growth and balancing the budget and creating jobs. And instead, what they're talking about is how they can give judges that they appoint more power to make laws that Canadians can never change.
They say in response to that criticism, James, that it's more about, trying to put limits on the ability, I think, of it to be invoked prior to a law being passed, that essentially the way it's being used by provinces isn't in line with the way it was intended. That's the argument they're putting forward. What do you make of that?
Well, I'm sort of struck by two things. One is, all of us have had the privilege of being in government on the government sides of legislatures of the federal parliament. And, whenever something comes across your desk, you're often challenged with the question of, do we actually need to do this, number one? If yes, do we actually need to do it right now? Are there not some other concerns that need to be pressed upon? And to that point, Doug Ford makes obviously a very valid and important point that when it comes to criminal justice issues and the attention of the Attorney General and Justice Minister of Canada, this should not be the dominant focal point. I understand there's a dynamic in the province of Quebec, but there are tensions in the Federation at all times when it comes to these kinds of matters. And I don't know why this is so pressing right now. You would have to knock on about 400 to 500,000 doors in the country before you found your first voter who said this should be the #1 priority of the Justice Minister and Attorney General of Canada, number one. Second thing is, Doug Ford was mostly right, but what he was wrong about is that, in the United States, the courts are supreme. In the UK, the Parliament is supreme. In Canada, we actually have kind of a hybrid model where we actually try to strike an appropriate balance, where we do have a Charter of Rights that protects citizens from the overreach and overbearing of government. That is true, but that capacity is limited, and the notwithstanding clause is part of the Charter because the Charter wouldn't exist without it as being an essential compromise to find an appropriate balance. Because there are times where courts do overreach and do go beyond the stretch and reach of majorities of the public who are not quite prepared to go there yet. So it can be invoked on a sunsetted basis with limited reviews, and it has to come back. And we've tried to strike an appropriate balance that I think has worked for Canada for a really long time. And to upset that balance for almost no political upside on the precipice of 2026 with a Quebec election on the horizon, I don't get why we're doing this now when there are other priorities.
Exactly.
Do you think, Marco, the balance is the right one?
Well, I think the answer is it's a tricky balance. But I want to come back to a point that James just made and others have made, which is that somehow this is being put on the table by the federal government. I mean, this is litigation that is being brought before the Supreme Court of Canada, and the Attorney General of Canada, Sean Fraser, has an obligation to respond. And I think his position distilled is that there is a risk that the notwithstanding clause becomes a shortcut to override rights. And that has a very tangible impact on people when it comes to religious expression, sexual orientation, labor rights, the construct of municipal governments. And so I do think it's responsible for the government of Canada to, in essence, be a friend of the court and say, here are the guiding constitutional principles which should help you decide this case. But I also do agree and sympathize with Premier Doug Ford that there are bigger priorities when it comes to the law and order agenda. And so I do think it is important, and I know that the Minister of Justice, Sean Fraser, and others are very concerned with putting forward a bail reform package that will toughen laws to crack down on repeat offenders. And I think the more that we can focus on that part of the agenda, then the less we'll get like the outbursts that we saw from Doug today. And without telling tales out of school, I know what that feels like. So you try to avoid it as much as possible.
I think if I were to sort of think about the politics of it for a second, Monty, it feels as though, look, premiers across the country are worried about the bail reform stuff and about, you know, general levels of crime. Like, I understand the point that they're making that, like, there are bigger fish to fry. And the other thing that has been, I think, notable about the last number of months is the degree to which the federal government and the provinces are talking, and the amount of dialogue and the amount of, you know, surprises like the one we talked about a few weeks ago when Premier Smith in Alberta was like singing the federal government's praises on this major projects list. So this feels like, I think, to the premiers, a needless irritant, and it's like one of the few schisms right now between provinces and the federal government.
I just don't know how it happened. This is a time where the minister needs to stand up to his public servants, to the lawyers in his department, and say, no, we're not going there. It is an unnecessary irritant. It creates all kinds of uncertainty. It's way off the agenda of most premiers. In fact, the government in general, the federal government in general, I just don't see why they're going there. And I think it would be quite wise of the minister to back down on this, withdraw this approach. They can fight it in other ways, I guess, but I think it's a real mistake to really stir the pot, cause that kind of upset that naturally will occur in Quebec, but also in Alberta for sure, and elsewhere too. So I think Doug Ford is spot on. Why are we going into this right now? It doesn't make any sense at all.
Well, is it possible, Christy, that the concern that they have is genuine, that basically something that was supposed to be on a temporary basis could have very permanent impacts on restricting rights?
Well, look, we have had this Charter of Rights and the notwithstanding clause for a long time in Canada, and it's worked.
For a while.
So yeah. I'm not sure. Again, I'm mystified that it's coming up. I don't think it's just the magic of the bureaucrats shoving something on the minister's desk. I really do think that this is linked to the election in Quebec and the trans legislation that's coming up in Alberta, and they're trying to find a way to look like they are responding to these things. It's uncomfortable for them, and if I was offering them advice, I would say, you don't need to. Stay focused on the bread and butter, get the economy growing, shrink the size and cost of government, fight the tariffs, do what people elected you to do, and don't get sidetracked with some of this other stuff.
James, I did just get into my inbox a statement. We asked for Minister Fraser to comment on what Premier Ford is saying. We just got a statement back in. Canadians are counting on us to adopt stronger laws to help ensure their communities are safe. The federal government will deliver on this commitment. Essentially, the entire statement references the upcoming pieces of legislation, which I think actually speaks to the politics of what we were just talking about, right? Like, the premiers want to be talking about bail reform and addressing what people in their communities are concerned about with crime. This statement references all that. I'm just looking at it, but I don't see many things about the notwithstanding clause in there.
Yeah. Well, so this is a politics show, right? So the politics and the issues management that the government could have taken about this that would have mitigated the blow up today from Premier Ford would have been for the Justice Minister to go to, frankly, each of the provinces, do a lap, go to each of the provinces and announce some justice legislation with the premiers and with their provincial attorneys general and talk about the other stuff that they're doing so that the provinces know that they have an ally, and announce some stuff in there, some tough on crime measures that have the support of provinces, and then maybe back end it with this, maybe. But even with that, but that would be sort of managing it and having good relations with the provinces as opposed to surprising them, then you get this blow up. However, I still believe in my first intervention, which was that, as a friend of mine often says, to succeed in government, the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. This is not the main thing for Canadian voters. They're focused on the cost of living. They're anxious about Donald Trump. They're worried about the $68 billion deficit and the rising dynamic of a failed economy. That's the main thing, not some internecine battle between lawyers and academics about the reach of the notwithstanding clause hypothetically in the future. Get to the issues that Canadians care about.
That's right.
Marco?
Well, I'd just like to see James put on some lawyer robes and go argue before the Supreme Court of Canada. I know that's really what he'd like to do. But actually, look, there are some important impacts in the Supreme Court of Canada case. As I said earlier, the individual rights which are at stake and which could be placed in jeopardy by a preemptive and successive invocation of the notwithstanding clause is important. But that does not change anything that I said in the first intervention, which is that the real priority here when it comes to law and order, and frankly when it comes to defending people's charter rights to go about their communities in a way that is safe and secure, is to table that bail reform package and to, as James said, work closely with the provinces and the territories to ensure that they can do that announcement together. And I know that's something that Minister Fraser is very much focused on doing.
Yeah, it feels like that announcement on the bail reform got to come soon, because already behind the scenes, a lot of provinces are saying, oh, it feels, at least communicating to me, it feels like it might be watered down. Like they need to address the issue fast.
Well, it takes one more incident before not just Doug Ford, but other premiers start doing press conferences and pounding their hand on the desk. I mean, it's having a real impact on their constituents, and you know, Doug Ford was worked up, but that's because people in places like Brampton are experiencing carjackings and crazy violent crimes that we just didn't really know about until the last few years, quite candidly, and we need to see that bail reform legislation come quickly, or you're going to see a lot of other premiers getting pretty upset.
It's coming. That's what the last line of this statement says. We're moving ahead with legislation this fall. Okay, thanks everybody. Great discussion. I really appreciate your time. Christy Clark, Marco Mendicino, James Moore, and Monty Solberg, our front bench.